For some analysis now, let's go live to Sydney, Australia, and Antony Loewenstein, who's an investigative journalist, also a filmmaker, as well as author of The Palestinian Laboratory: How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World. Antony, it's good to have you.
Thank you.
So look, I'm really interested in talking about this flight path that the Prime Minister took. We'll get to that in a moment, but first I'm wondering if you could help me preview what we could expect in the hours ahead with Benjamin Netanyahu's address to the UN. What are you expecting to hear during his remarks?
Belligerence, arrogance, and hubris. Netanyahu has a long history of being like this, and even though there are now growing pressures on Israel around the world. You know, you have a situation where Spain is imposing military embargo. They're not buying Israeli weapons. You have growing numbers of European states, Australia recognizing Palestine, although I would argue that's mostly lip service. The country that Israel needs is the US, clearly. And Trump so far has been not that dissimilar, frankly, to Biden, 110% supportive of what Israel is doing in Gaza, the West Bank and elsewhere. So I would expect a speech to denounce these Western states that have recognized Palestine. There's a growing kind of thinking around this, and there's been some leaked documents coming out of the Israeli mission in New York, which essentially goes around that Israel frames itself as on the front lines of a kind of global war against Islamic terrorism and Muslims in general, claiming that the only real reason, this is what Netanyahu probably will say, and it's what Israeli government believes, the only reason that many Western states now recognize Palestine is because of pressure from domestic Muslim constituents. I mean, it's complete nonsense, by the way, but that's the line. And I think, therefore, what Israel is framing itself as, and which is why growing numbers of the right and the far right globally support, is that kind of hard ethno-nationalist apartheid state. That's what Israel is today.
Yeah, in addition to perhaps criticizing some of those nations that have added to their list of countries that recognize a Palestinian state, I'm curious if he's going to also address an audience of one, the man in the White House. Now, in terms of what could potentially be a pressure point in the war on Gaza, do you expect that President Trump may tell the Prime Minister when he meets with him next week what he told reporters in the Oval Office this week, which is that he will not allow Israel to annex parts of the occupied West Bank?
I mean, we can hope so, but it's important to say that viewers understand annexation has basically happened. It's not official. It's not a declaration from the Israeli government, but anyone who spends any time in the West Bank for years, as I have, as a reporter, will say that settler violence against Palestinians, Israeli soldier violence, is so off the chart. There have been thousands upon thousands of Palestinians which have been ethnically cleansed from Palestine in the last 2 years in the West Bank since October 7. So, yes, annexation is not formally declared, but ultimately we've seen, even, for example, after the recent attack by Israel on Doha, on the Hamas elements in Qatar, Arab states' response was so mild. They are very, very reliant on US support, and they know that. So yes, I saw that result of the meeting, and Israel says that they're going to be told they can't annex. But frankly, Israel's doing it anyway by default without doing it officially. That's what worries me deeply.
And CNN has already reached out to the Prime Minister's office to try to ask about the leader's flight plan to the U.S. As we know, there's some flight tracking websites that show that his official plane seemed to avoid European countries. Certainly not accidental here, especially those countries that could potentially enforce an arrest warrant for the crimes, the war crimes that the Prime Minister denies. So how telling should that be about this growing gap between the Prime Minister and some of the nations that were previously key European allies of his? The fact that he wanted to avoid as much of them as he could as he flew here to the United States.
There's a bit of a disconnect between the European people and European bureaucracies. From the EU, the base in Brussels, there's been lots of talk in the last 2 years of greater action against Israel as Israel's genocide in Gaza worsens. But on the bottom line is very little has happened. The EU is still buying heaps of Israeli weapons and surveillance tech. That is the reality. And yes, there is growing pressure within European states. Just in the last week, there was mass strikes in Italy in support of Palestine. There's obviously Spain and other nations which are increasingly openly against what Israel is doing. But still 2 years on after this genocide has begun, the European Union remains, I would say, almost paralyzed by its inaction. So, yes, Netanyahu's plane may well have changed its flight path, although it's worth saying that French officials told the Israeli press that they'd given permission for Israel to fly across its territory. So, ultimately, the Europeans have leverage and they're not generally using, and that's a shame. It's an outrage, actually.
We have to leave it there. Antony Loewenstein, as always, thank you so much for coming on and offering your perspective.
Thanks for having me.